Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello, and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club program. I'm Patty James, chair of the club's new Nutrition, Food, and Wellness member-led forum. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Alyssa Epel, author of The Stress Prescription, 7 Days to More Joy and Ease. Dr. Epel is a leading psychologist who studies stress, aging, and obesity. She is the director of UCSF's Aging, Metabolism, and Emotion Center and is associate director of its Center for Health and Community. Dr. Epel also co-wrote The Telomere Effect, the revolutionary approach to living younger, healthier, longer, with Nobel laureate Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, who will be moderating tonight's event. A reminder to our audience, if you have a question for Dr. Epel or Dr. Blackburn, please submit those in the YouTube chat. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Alyssa Epel and Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn back to the Commonwealth Club.
So, Alyssa, let me start off by asking you to share with the audience how your own journey into understanding stress first began, and then how that led into the journey of understanding stress, first of all, in the context of cell aging.
Thank you, Liz. It's so nice to be giving a talk with you again, even if it's virtual, and thanks to the Commonwealth Club for hosting us. So it was really way back in probably 2001, and I first arrived at UCSF and working with Nancy Adler, and this health psychology program was really pursuing this question of how does stress get under the skin? How could we measure the effects of stress on health beyond something like blood pressure, where we know stress increases blood pressure, and if that goes on, it might turn into hypertension. But really wanting to understand at the cellular level, was there an imprint of stress? Was it lasting? Could we see it even in young people? And so that led me to read this basic science of cell aging, which was really all over the map, but a very consistent theme that kept coming up was our growing understanding of how telomeres contribute to the aging of organisms. And that to me was just miraculous to think, and that we could actually measure this mechanism, the tips of the chromosomes, these telomere caps, that we could possibly measure them in large groups of humans and understand what might shorten them besides genetics and the clock ticking chronological age. And so that is about when I came knocking at your door, Liz. It was just also amazing to me that you were here at UCSF, and that was the system I wanted to study. And so I was very hopeful, and you opened your door so graciously. And then we brought in our third colleague in this big, long journey, Julien, who was also a postdoc at that time. And in that first study, I think no one had measured telomerase in normal cells. And so it was this question of, can you do it? Can you use this assay that was used for measuring telomerase levels in cancerous cells, 10 times higher? And I think for me, I collected cells of women who are under chronic stress and care and control, so caregivers and controls. And I brought you the cells, and then the rest was really a mystery of what happened in your lab. But you and Ju really optimized this assay so that we were able to measure the low levels of telomerase with such granularity, so carefully. And then the big question was, does that measure, let's say, of this anti-aging enzyme telomerase, does that correlate? Does that match up with the level of stress this group of women was feeling? And I remember just seeing that correlation, seeing those dots line up. It was a pretty strong correlation for what we see in mind-body connections, and my heart was racing, and I emailed you immediately, and so that's.
I think you called. I think we used the
I called you.
telephone.
I was going to say I called you, and I was like, that doesn't sound right. We don't pick up the phone these days. What did I say? Do you remember?
I knew, I can't remember the words, but you definitely were excited because there was a very real, quantifiable relationship between the degree of stress and these measures of telomere maintenance. Yes.
And it lined up for the other cell aging measures we had for telomere length, for level of oxidative stress. And it wasn't just the feelings of stress that was associated with cell aging, it was also the years of caregiving, the duration. So that was our first study. And from there, it's been a wild ride of being able to measure the cell aging system in many different samples. And the field just has grown so much. And then other colleagues like Owen Wolkowitz has taken this to the mental health area. So we now know depression is pretty consistently associated with this cell aging system as well, at least shorter telomeres.
Yes, it's one of the aspects of how cells age through our many decades of life, and people didn't know if it was going to be something that could be affected by things that affect our health, because we knew that telomere shortening has an effect on cells being able to replenish and be healthy, and that in turn contributes, if the telomeres are not made properly, when the cells telomeres wear down too much, then cells can't function. And in fact, that shortness can cause heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, dementia, reduced cognitive function, and even certain cancers. And that's been shown by causal reasons, but very importantly by studies of the kind Alyssa talks about, and many studies that relate the association of shorter telomeres with many risks of common kinds of conditions or diseases. So that's why we cared about this, and as you will hear, so importantly, why we care about stress, because this is one of the very direct ways stress has bad effects on our cells. And we're going to talk more about the kinds of stress that we're talking about, because I think that's a really important point about your book. But basically, things that keep telomeres maintained included things like exercise and eating a healthy diet. But it turned out that having bad chronic stress over and over again is related to having shorter telomeres, and hence there's risks of these diseases in humans, and therefore, threats to our long-term health.
Mm-hmm. So now, 18 years later, Liz, and this measure of telomere length has been in so many human studies showing prediction of early disease and even early mortality. And at the same time, this field of aging has just blown up with so many measures, biomarkers that people use of aging. And so I would love to hear how you view telomeres in the context of all the other ways we measure aging.
Yes. Well, I think, and very much inspired by the kind of work we've done together, we think of it in a very sort of integrated way. It's one kind of readout of a whole very integrated set of systems that go on in our bodies. And there are various ways that cells age. Their proteins, get less protected and less functional. There's so many different ways. So what I'm excited about is we know telomeres reflect a lot of aspects of aging. They cause some aspects of aging. And in human studies, we often see effects of telomere shortness related in a kind of statistical way, and the predictions are not that strong. But what's been very exciting in recent human studies coming up, it is when you have all these different aspects of aging, telomere is one aspect. But if you combine the degree of telomere shortness as a predictor with something else as a predictor, something as simple as frailty or pre-frailty, which relates to how strong and how heartily somebody can walk. If you combine those two together and look at the degrees of those, you find that those together are much more powerful at predicting, serious cardiovascular events and death in people if you follow them on. And and even other aspects of life that impinge on our ability to stay healthy, such as socioeconomic conditions. If you combine that actually with telomere measures, the two actually synergistically predict even more, of all things, risks of dementias. So there's new studies coming out where you combine telomere measures with other things. I'm really excited about that because it's getting at the complexity of all of the things that are going on as we age and lose our health. But it's not just looking at it in isolation. It's trying to understand the whole interactive system. So these are studies in their early stages, but I'm excited about this. Because for so long we looked at telomeres carefully isolating that factor from others, because that's how you do science, but it's not how human bodies work.
Right.
And these together.
Exactly. And aging is so complex and multifactorial, and there are different ways that we age. And so it's so lovely that we know there's a consistent but small, robust effect of telomere length alone. But then when and it's reflecting how long can our cells from dividing tissues keep going, dividing, replenishing, creating new tissue in important areas of our body, like the brain and the cardiovascular lining. And so it's about replicative senescence, how much our cells can keep going on and dividing. But then you take something like frailty, that's really about whole body aging, and you combine that to this molecular measure about particularly we measure in the immune cells. And so that is incredibly useful. And I look forward to when we have, better algorithms that people can use, clinical algorithms that incorporate telomeres.
But I think they may not have to be so complex. We look at huge amounts of bioinformatic data and huge amounts of, gene expression data and so forth. And but certain things, I think, capture it. It's amazing that frailty, which is such a vague sounding thing, and telomere length, which we measure in so many different cells all at once, you'd think, does this really show you something systemic? But I think it starts to show systemic things. One of the things that I know you're really interested in is, telomeres, when they run down in immune cells, they also make cells not function so well and put out more inflammatory signals. And I know you're very interested in the inflammatory aspects of aging, and perhaps you would like to talk a little bit more about that and stress.
Yes. And you might want to comment, driving down a little more molecular. But what we see at the clinical level, we and others have now measured different aspects of types of stress and adversity. And so what's so interesting is that when we look at different types of stress, we know the types that really do wear down these cell aging systems. So early life adversity, particularly in a dose response fashion, early trauma when we're children, or even severe stress to a pregnant mother that also predicts short telomeres in the offspring. So we know that childhood is a very imprinting time for this system, the telomere length. It's also true in some studies, chronic stress.
And that gets me to something that I think at this point would be great to introduce, because we use this word stress.
Yes.
And, in some cultures, there are large numbers of words for the word snow, right? There are many subtleties. We use a single word, stress, but because you taught me this, that stress is a lot of different things. And one of the things that I remember you told me that was very helpful, and it comes through in your book, but in different phrasings, is you use the term challenge stress, which is good stress. You see that as a challenge, and you distinguish that sort of response to stress by people versus another term called threat stress.
Yes.
It's seen as a threat. And I found that shorthand, and I know it's a shorthand, you're much more specialized in this deeper understanding of all the nuances of stress. But I found that a very helpful shorthand. And could you tell us a bit more about that? Because I think that it pervades your new book, this thinking. But is that shorthand still a helpful way of thinking about it? Challenge stress versus
yes,
stress?
absolutely. It's fundamental for us to realize that a lot of the stresses we go through are good stress, but even more importantly, what we make of it, we can have a good stress response to short-term stressors. And so challenge and threat stress are just two very fundamental ways for us to understand the stress response. So psychologically, when we think of challenge stress, think of when you're putting yourself in situations that there's risk, there's stakes, there's opportunity. We're often trying to achieve things that means we're taking risks. So sports psychology is very focused on challenge stress. It's incredibly stressful to perform or to form in any way, giving a speech, but also in terms of athletic performance. And so you really want to be focusing all of your energy on the meaning and purpose of this, that there's opportunity for gain, that you're doing this because you care, that you're doing this for love. There's all sorts of reasons why we push ourselves to grow and take these risks. And so that's part of the psychological positive challenge response. And we measure that in the lab. My colleague, Wendy Mendez, has done, fundamental work on this, showing that when we can induce and help people have a positive challenge response to some stressful task, they perform better. They have more positive emotion. Their whole blood response, their hemodynamic cardiovascular response is different. It's this tremendous output of from the heart, oxygenating the brain. And that's really different than that more threatened response. And so that more of like the freeze, flee response instead of the fight response is more characterized by vasoconstriction and fear and anxiety. So we often think of that as like the lion is chasing the gazelle. The lion is having this positive challenge response because the lioness, she wants dinner and this is an opportunity, but it's still a physiological stress response. The gazelle is feeling threat for her life. So she's having a very different response. So we can think about that in terms of psychological response. We can also stress out our body, and we can talk more about that, but we can create positive stress in the body in these short-term bursts that is most definitely stress reducing. It's metabolizing stress in the body. And at the cellular level, it's creating a very kind of profound, fundamental positive stress response we call hormetic stress, which is very much turning on these healthy mechanisms that help the cell. And we know from our acute stress studies, when we stress people out in a very short-term way, telomerase goes up. Telomerase is a defense system. It's stress responsive, protecting the telomeres.
So I think this takes us right into your new book, which is really about this and talks so much about the different kinds of stress and really sort of unpacks the distinctions between, this term stress, which I think people can misunderstand and think, oh, you just have to sort of avoid everything in life that would give you stress. Well, I think your book talks about the fact that, of course, that's not possible. It's about how you respond to stress. So let's turn now fully to your book so we can explore all of these topics. And can I ask you, first of all, what motivated you to write this book?
People loved understanding telomeres and that they have telomeres and that they're in every cell and that they're something partly under our control. We can protect our telomeres. And that stress chapter just brought up so many questions. People loved to understand how our stress response was related. And so in that book, we introduced the idea that chronic toxic stress and trauma was wearing to the telomeres, but that we could promote this kind of positive stress response, make stress work for us, have a quicker, more efficient stress response. And that actually is good for us, good for our coping, good for our health. And so the book kind of fleshes out those ideas in 7 chapters, each aspect. And while I didn't talk about telomeres much in the book, this is what we know is that we're all living with way too much perceived stress. Daily stress is high. Most people feel 46% of the adult US population feels overwhelmed by stress. That's absolutely absurd. That's so out of hand. And we know the effect on our health and our aging. And so it's really a medical issue. And so I love the idea of thinking of it as a prescription, because we know we take prescriptions for medical conditions very seriously. And we need to take this seriously as well. We need to really try to disrupt the daily stress habits that we're in. And so there are lots of different ways to do that. But I was most motivated by realizing how majority of people feel they're under too much stress. And we know from science so many different ways we can reduce stress, in addition to yoga, meditation, and exercise. Those are fabulous lifestyles, habits, and they help a lot. But there are a lot of other ways too.
Mm. And so the structure was very interesting. Seven days worth. It's a 7 days, right? Is how it's
Right.
described in your book. By the way, I have multiple copies of this book because I'm giving it to my friends and family as well.
Aw.
And because I think it's really a very helpful book for exactly the reasons that you pointed out. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about the 7 days. Well, why 7 days? Is that something? I'd love to hear why.
Yes. So I think thinking of what we can do within a day is so useful, because we live within the unit of time of a day. We think about each day as fresh and new, and we recover from a day by reflecting on the day. And so how we wake up and how we recover are so important to our emotional well-being. And so we can wake up mindlessly with an alarm and a to-do list and grab this, and that's a habit, a common habit, and I am guilty of doing that often. But we can also choose to wake up and orient our body and mind toward having a day of ease and joy, not just stress. And so I talk about different tips for those bookends, but the 7 days is really, we also want to have help that's not going to, be a 400-page book that takes months to read. And so it's really, our attention span is about a 7-day book. It's about the length of that. So the idea was just really reduce the science and the practices into 7 fundamental tips, and people could read it in a week. But of course, to incorporate it, take your time, choose one habit, try it every day for a week, try the book with a partner. So it shouldn't stress you out. You shouldn't get the book and think, I have to learn all of this in 7 days. Added stress.
And what's your biggest hope? What do you most hope that people will get from it? There's so much one can get from it. What do you hope people will get from it?
Well, let's see. I'll talk about two big points of the book. So one is understanding our mind-body connection, our personal mind-body connection. And we're not just either on, awake, and then off, we go to sleep. We have all of these levels of arousal, from high stress arousal, that red dot at the top, all the way down to deep blue mind states, which are relaxing. And
so the picture in the cover is depicting sort of this whole set of different states, which you describe all the way from red to blue states of, I don't know if it's, states of mind, right?
Yes, states of mind. And so we certainly know when we're in red mind. I mean, this is like the whole body, the heart is pounding, and we know it feels terrible. We're dealing with some stressor, or maybe it's exciting. We're dealing with a positive challenge, and we need that stress response. That's why we're here. We would never survive. Our ancestors would never have survived if we didn't have this beautiful immediate stress response. And the problem is that we don't necessarily recover and turn that off quickly and live in a relaxed state. We live in more what we call yellow mind, which is like we're holding on to stress, either ruminating about what happened or worrying about what's going to happen next, anticipating, being vigilant. And so it might even be unconscious that we're just holding stress in our body. Like right now, to all of you listening, like just ask, are your hands relaxed? Are your shoulders relaxed? What are you holding on to? And just quick check-ins like that can help us notice that we're not relaxed. We're carrying stress with us. And when it's strong like that, it just becomes chronic stress, like a habit. And so that default mode of how we spend most of our time in yellow mind is something we can all become more aware of. We inevitably set ourselves up for that when we're rushing, right? We plan a whole day that's intense and back to back. And of course, our body's not going to be in a true relaxed space. It's going to be in yellow mind. So these quick mindful check-ins can help. And then green mind is when we're really truly relaxed. We can get that from being in nature. Our bodies are very attuned to the sensory signals and the safety signals within nature. And then deep rest or blue mind is more of a rare state, but it's very restorative. And we have a whole paper on my website led by Alexandra Croswell that really describes and helps us understand, there's a state that we're missing. And if we can do some things, feel safe, sequester ourselves, put a short amount of time aside, and actually let ourselves truly relax. Usually this is a mind-body activity, yoga nidra, meditation, massage. There's all sorts of ways, like the shavasana after yoga. These are deeply restorative states when our heart rate variability can increase and our parasympathetic nervous system can be dominant. And of course, we get deep rest when we're sleeping, and especially in deep sleep. And that's our most restorative state our body's ever in. But we can give our body breaks at least once a week in these blue mind states as well. So I think just understanding and checking in and saying, do I need to be stressed right now? And doing these release exercises, I give breathing exercises and ways to mindfully check in and release or catch and release stress, including uncertainty stress. We're always kind of vigilant about the future, even if we're not realizing it.
So could you expand more on the strategies for how to reduce these these harmful responses to stress? Not reducing stress per se in the sense that we can't always reduce external stressors, but strategies for how we modulate, reduce our poor responses to stress, how we make responses, good responses to stress. Could you, I know you talk about it in the book, but I think people would love to hear a preview of
Yes, absolutely. So I think if I were to, cut to the chase and ask someone about their what their stress habits are, I'd want to look at their day. I'd want to know, do they have some positive red mind and deep rest states? So like kind of being in this murky, subtle level of arousal, yellow mind state, we can go on the whole day like that without releasing it through positive hormetic stress in our body, like exercise, or there are other ways too, or really consciously relaxing and doing some slower breathing. That's an incredibly fast and direct way to reduce the stress that we hold in our nervous system and slow our heart rate and increase our heart rate variability. So just having the idea that we each need some of these kind of green and blue mind states every day, as well as some of the positive stress, at least in our body. And so there are other ways besides high intensity interval training or quick bursts of aerobic exercise. There's heating up the body. So there's sauna, and that helps with cardiovascular health, but also with mood, with stress, depression, anxiety. There's also cooling the body, cold showers or ice. And that is starting to be more studied. And there's all sorts of old literatures like cryotherapy and how that can help depression and other chronic, more emotional conditions. And we've been studying, as I think we've talked about, Liz, this Wim Hof method. So this increasing our positive stress through extreme breathing, some breath holding, and also the cold showers. And so far, we found that works to take a chunk out of stress and depression just as well as meditation and exercise. So there are many paths to reducing daily stress, and people just need to, experiment and find what works for them, but probably trying some of the both high arousal and low arousal strategies is a best strategy.
So to understand this a bit more, so you're saying there's a tremendous number of different ways and kinds and modes of achieving these better mind states and reducing one's harmful responses to stress. But you've laid out many different fascinating possibilities. How is a person to navigate through there? How will they start? So they know
Right.
they always come home from work or finish their day of Zooms of work these days in a red to yellow state. How to what's the way to begin to get somebody on this path? Given that there are so many such a menu of
Yes, yes. And what I was talking about was changing the body to change the mind, either going to low arousal states or high arousal states. But there are also ways to other ways. So one is certainly we can talk about top-down strategies, changing how we our beliefs about stress and mindset. But let me just mention one that I know you use a lot, Liz, which is change the scene. And that is getting out in nature.
Yes. And I'm very lucky that I have the opportunity to do that. So that's one thing that one can do if you have the opportunity to go walking or sometimes to travel to parts of the world that are awe-inspiring. And you write in your book about how awe is something, AWE, not OAR, awe is something that itself has stress-reducing properties, which I found was truly fascinating, because that to me is so intrinsic to why I love being in nature. But to sort of come back to a little bit more of the sort of practical, let's say you're somebody who always is in this yellow to red state at the end of their day or throughout their day. Are there things that you can start to say to them to get them on the road to
yes. So we'll talk about that. That's, starts with a stress assessment. But before we leave awe, I did notice that Dr. Keltner, who studies awe, is speaking soon here at the Commonwealth Club. And awe is really a transformative emotion. And Liz, that's how you and I have met over the last few years, since haven't been in our office much with COVID, was really walking in your neighborhood. And I always love how you notice new things and you're pointing out, a beautiful bloom or garden to me or a view. And that is really what that nature chapter is about. It's not just that we want to be in a forest or notice greenery in our home, but to actually really immerse ourselves in our senses. So looking and seeing things very carefully and close up, and touching leaves or trees and smelling the air. So all of those put us in a sensory or experiential state. And that is kind of an antidote to stress. We can't both be in this awe state or a state of opening our sensory gates and highly stressed at the same time. So that's how I think about nature, is that it's a way where we don't have to think our way out of stress, but rather just let our body do the unwinding for us by opening our senses. Okay, so you are wondering where to start. I would say that most of us could benefit from stepping back and reflecting on the different stressful situations in our lives. So taking a stress inventory, and there are ways in the book I lead people to just write freely every situation that's weighing on them or making them feel pressure or something that's unwanted situations. And so it can be this enormous free floating list, and then really noticing what on this list is out of my control. What is something I completely don't control, or maybe there are aspects of this situation that I control. So it's really kind of creating a bucket of, I don't control this. This is a gray area bucket. Some of the situation I control, or completely in my control. And what we often realize is that so much of what is upsetting us are situations that we have very little control over. And the freedom that comes with understanding and seeing that we're spinning wheels or ruminating or doing a lot of problem solving about things that we really can't change can be very liberating. And is a really big way to kind of reduce the burden of stress that we carry around. And then, of course, there are ways to focus on those things that we can control, like asking, are there any of these situations that I can actually decide that I'm going to take this out of my schedule, or cross this obligation off or delegate it to someone else. And sometimes there's nothing we can delete, but often with really honest, careful reflection, there are ways that we can reduce the density of responsibilities, meetings, ways that we fill up our time to create spaciousness. And so that stress inventory can be very helpful for people, because if we're rushing, we just can't. We've ruled out the possibility of having breaks during the day, and we've kept kind of that red mind state, or, the alarms on all day. And that's very hard to feel the joy in life, feel the opportunities in front of us, even just reading someone else's emotions and connecting with someone intimately. It's very hard to do that in red and yellow mind. And it's wonderfully easy when we're actually in our body and letting go of, the worrying rumination and the worrying that we carry.
So then let's say one has done the inventorying and one now has a better sense of those in control, not in control things. Where would you lead people next on this path to helping them take the next steps? Would it be exercise? Would it be joining? What's the sort of process?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it would be.
What's your prescription?
Yeah. Well, what did you? I think there's the different ways of creating stress to our body: hot, cold exercise, extreme breathing. There are ways that we can create a safe, let's say, green corner of the house or room, or actually being out in nature. And that might be a place that someone does either slow breathing or prayer or meditation. And, it's always wonderful if it fits in your religion or belief system. So it's kind of a fill in the blank prescription. Like, we could all do well these days with all the existential stress, with waking up and having a vow, something that's meaningful to us that we say, or a prayer, or setting an intention. And so the same words, so I offer different ideas of what might be meaningful to people, and they really need to choose. So what about for you, Liz? Did you try anything new, or notice that you were already doing some of these stress prescriptions?
Well, I've had the good luck to be able to go walking. I walk almost daily, and I certainly do try and notice my body. The prompt that you gave for us to feel, are our shoulders tense or our hands tense? I do try and check in a lot with that, and then consciously try to, relax that. The one that did strike me was one that I hadn't thought of as reducing stress, and that's the one we talked about before, which was awe, the feeling of awe and wonder and so forth. And not just in nature. We're sometimes awed at just, a book we're reading in a marvelous way somebody has of describing something. I mean, we can have awe for the talent of somebody, or extraordinary painting. We just have awe for that, work of art that was created. So I think awe can come in lots of ways. And so to me, reading and seeing that awe was actually part of what you're prescribing in this stress prescription, that for me was a new revelation. So I think that you talk about hormetic stress. and you explain what that means. But in a way, it sort of seems to be partly encompassed in the idea of challenge stress. Is that too simple? I mean, hormetic stress means you actually put a stress on your body, but in a shorter term, so you can recover. And presumably, it's something that you have control over, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The hormetic stress concept.
I think that's a great point. They're very. There's some commonalities of the types of positive stress we put ourselves through mentally, and when we put our body through that. And I like to think of when we're putting ourselves under hormetic stress, if we're doing, high intensity interval training or a cold shower, it's very easy to have a threat response and say, oh, this feels terrible. Like if the cold shower makes you gasp and tense up and
Yes.
it's stressful.
Yes.
And so, that's a normal threat response that we have, even if it's mild, but we can promote this positive response so that we're not also triggering an emotional stress response with a lot of cortisol by reminding ourselves, oh, this is actually good for me. This is an opportunity for my body, that my body loves this. My body is excited. So we can say some of these statements during this positive body stress or hormetic stress so that we're actually pushing our comfort zone and relaxing into it at the same time.
Yes. So knowing
Rather
it's
than
not
tensing
threat
up.
stress, like being really cold could mean, well, you're out stuck in a snowstorm and you'd better do something. That's a real threat to your, existence. But the cold, you're saying, I'm in control of this. I did this cold and this is not hurting me. I'm not in danger. So I can be cold, even though one's normal reaction is usually a pretty self-preserving reaction to
Right.
sudden cold.
And we need to be sensitive when we're talking about cold these days, right? Given the snowstorms, et cetera, back east.
Yes, yeah.
Really everywhere, because
Yes.
it's wonderful if you have to rush to the car, you can go through that and say, my body loves this in a short-term burst and it can handle this, and then it's going to recover once you're in the warm car. But there's a real difference between getting too cold, that when it becomes too many minutes and so short-term hormetic stress is really short bursts and then recovery, short bursts and recovery. And so same with psychological stress. So Liz, when you think about hormetic stress, I mean, as a basic scientist or biologist, it's a very old idea. So what do you think of?
Oh, I'm learning about it. This is quite far from my molecular biology training, but I do know that cells have responses to stress that, again, allow them to deal with, biochemical kinds of insults, and cells set programs into motion inside themselves that deal with stress. So even down at the level of inside cells, they're responding in various kinds of ways that are appropriate to the nature of the stress. They respond. So it's sort of fascinating that it's such an all-encompassing concept, stress. And in fact, we're getting to the time where we want to turn to questions. And in fact, the questions which are coming in actually is really, I think, come very directly from this. So if I can, we'll turn to these questions because I think it'll allow you to expand more on, for example, these concepts of stress that we're talking about. And one question is, what is the biggest misconception about stress?
One of the attitudes we have about stress is that all stress is bad. And I think even stress researchers like me are responsible or guilty of promoting that, because we use the word stress as this umbrella term. And it covers, we then kind of think, well, any type of stress is bad. And just that thought is bad for us. So there's like very lovely research on stress mindsets showing that when we believe, well, let me just make it clear that chronic toxic stress really is wearing, and there's not much controversy about that. But most of the stress we're talking about breaks down to daily stress or events or shorter term stress. And that it really is can have hormetic qualities or challenge stress qualities. So there's research showing that when we believe that stress is bad, damaging, is hurting us, then when we go through a lapse stressor or short-term stress, we actually get more stressed by it. And we have a bigger physical response and slower recovery. And so there's kind of a blossoming of research on stress mindset by Aaliyah Crum and others. And conversely, it shows that when you focus on the benefits of stress, when you believe stress is good for me, it helps me grow, it challenges me in a good way, it's good for my body, all of that is also true. And if you believe that, it's more true. So it's amazing, but our beliefs are shaping our stress response in these self-fulfilling ways. So it's very important for us to focus on these positive benefits of stress and go into a stressful situation, reminding ourselves, my body can handle this. I'm prepared for this. I will get through this. Whatever we're saying to ourselves in those moments matters because our body is listening, our stress response is responding. So we might as well go with these positive statements.
And that leads us actually into the next question from our audience, which is, do you have advice for caregivers in dealing with stress management or for dealing with stress management? I think you already started to.
Well, I will say my heart goes out to all caregivers, regardless of, there's so many different types of caregiving. And usually when we study them, we've done a lot of studies on them. Our first study was of parents, of mothers of children with chronic conditions. We often study family dementia caregivers, so people caring for a partner or a parent. And the caregiving stress really is one of the hardest types of situations because it goes on for years and years, and caregivers often give up their own self-care, and they often suffer health problems. So there's a lot of studies showing the stress effects of chronic caregiving, like slower wound healing, and in our study, shorter telomeres. So the good news is, in our studies of caregiving, it's really not just being a caregiver that predicts these, it's really the response to the stressor. So when we're feeling overly stressed and develop depression and don't have a lot of resources, that's when caregiving really starts to take its toll. But many caregivers look like controls, and they're having different aspects of resilience. There's no question that maintaining a healthy lifestyle is incredibly important for caregivers. So exercise is incredibly important for breaking up the caregiving stress. And Eli Putterman with us, Liz, showed that elderly dementia caregivers who are sedentary, when they exercise, he took one group and randomized them and had them exercise for 6 months. 6 months later, they had less depression, less daily rumination, and longer telomeres than the control group. So we do think that, maybe that finding wouldn't show up in non-caregivers. It was a pretty dramatic finding, but it's when you're under stress, exercise can have such a strong stress buffering effect. It can also help with depression. It's important for caregivers to take respite seriously and to ask for support and to know there's a caregiver's bill of rights that they might benefit from reading online that describes you have a right to take care of yourself and to put yourself first. And it's hard to care for someone when you can't care for yourself. So that oxygen mask analogy of put your own mask on first. Another aspect of caregiver stress is realizing that you can't control someone else's illness or health behaviors and really just doing what you can and not striving harder. And I really like to think in those types of uncontrollable stressful situations of like pulling a rope that's tied to a brick wall, and you can pull and pull, and the wall hasn't moved and your hands chafe and you're exhausted. But if you drop the rope and you say, this is, I'm not going to be able to move that wall, you've freed up your hands to do the little bits that you can for your own self-care, for being present and compassionate with the person you love.
Yeah. And another question takes us to another kind of situation of stress. And this question is, a lot of us encounter stress at work. Are there companies that are doing or providing innovative resources to help their employees deal with stress?
Oh, well, certainly that's.
This is a question from our audience again.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. And this brings us to, again, this question of understanding what we control and what we can't control. And work stress is a tricky one because while, of course, there are workplaces, some are very enlightened and enriched and allow a lot of employee control over their time and give them a lot of both responsibility but control, aspects of control. That's very helpful. But many industries like healthcare, like our institution, there are structural reasons that we are so prone to burnout. When the demand is too high, the resources are too low, there's not enough staff, and there's not a feeling of equity or control or getting credit for your work. All of those pieces are very important to help prevent burnout. And so when we tell someone to meditate, when they're working in a environment that's promoting burnout, that really does have these structural ways of depleting us, then it's not going to work. It only goes so far. And so really it's both these kind of banding together and really trying to create a healthier work structure and environment, as well as offering the individual strategies, time out for self-care, meditation rooms at work. Those are all great if we also are not creating burnout in the first place. So it's always something we still haven't solved at a national level, and that's why we're having, certainly the great retirement has hit, let's say, medicine and healthcare in a big way.
Another question from our audience has come in, which is, can you talk about the role, if any, that gender plays in stress? Perhaps that relates to some of these workplace situations that you're talking about. But the question was, does gender play a role in stress?
Mm-hmm. It absolutely does. And when we think about, well, first of all, women report more stress than men. Women also suffer from more depression than men. And when we look at the data, like the most recent APA survey on stress in America, it's very revealing. Now, I said 46% of people report feeling overwhelmed by stress. But when you look at who is most stressed, it's very much depends on who you ask. So women more than men, young people more than older people, and people of color or groups that are discriminated against are feeling the most stress. And so when you think about overlap, or this idea of intersectionality, then we have young women who are also people of color having the absolute highest levels of stress. They have the least structural control, least power, the most discrimination. So there are structural factors working against them, as well as being of lower status given their age. And so it's very interesting. When we look at the data on feeling that you can't go on, you're so stressed you can't go on, the data shows that young women are in the very high levels, in the 60%. But when you look at women over 65, it's more like less than 10%. So we see this tremendous resilience with aging. So we know that youth are vulnerable, or young adults are quite vulnerable, but we should also ask, well, why are older people so resilient? Yes, they have more loneliness, but they're not going to despair and daily stress like our young adults are. So there's a lot of beautiful research on the resilience with aging, the wisdom, the not sweating the small stuff, and the having these positive social networks. That is something we can all learn from.
Well, that might lead me to the next question, which is the converse. So you've told us about the increasing knowledge and understanding of resilience. Well, what are some of the most absurd old wives' tales about stress?
Wondering what if
I think maybe it
Yeah.
relates to our first question from the audience. What are
Mhm.
some of the real misconceptions about stress?
Mhm. Yeah. Would love. Yeah, I'm as a stress researcher. I'm always just focused on what is stress. What do people think stress is? And if you
Mm.
ask an economist, they think it's unemployment and divorce. If you ask a psychologist, it's feelings of stress. If you ask a physiologist, it's cortisol. So we're all talking about different things.
Mm.
And all of these are related. So these things that happen to us may cause more feelings of stress. They may cause a physical reaction, but I'll just say that these correlations are a lot lower than anyone would think. They're not at all the same thing. There's so much variance in how we respond. Different people respond to different events, both emotionally and physically.
So people sort of assume that a misconception or an absurd idea is that somehow everyone's going to have the same reaction. Is that?
Or just that, stress is the same thing as cortisol.
Yes. And really, it does make me think over and over again. I've thought, well, do we need some better language to describe stress? Like the cultures who have many words for snow. We have one word in the English language, snow, right? But there's so many different forms. Should you lead a movement to have not be overly technical, but just have a little more precision so people don't have misconceptions, because it can be so helpful when one understands what's going on.
Well, it's funny that you say that, Liz. I almost know that.
For your next book.
Well, no, let me just mention we have a stress network at UCSF that many of us co-lead that is about measurement. We have a toolbox. So if you type in UCSF stress network, you'll find that we actually are trying to do exactly that, Liz, for the field. We're trying to, funded by NIH, we're trying to have people be more specific about the types of stress that they're measuring in different studies, and how, looking at something like challenge stress to a situation is very different than looking at, trauma reactions to early life adversity. Right. So it's just, there's so many different measures and types.
And this may lead into a partial answer to the next question, which has to be almost the last, but I'll have one more after this. But the question was, do we think that most doctors understand stress and, for example, stress and telomeres? Perhaps and I'll just partly answer that. Perhaps, having this helpful, more precise definition of stress will make it easier for doctors to be able to be asking the right questions, which then will relate better to whether there are threats that can be measured by, statistically at least, by things like telomeres and how they're maintained.
Yes, that's a great answer.
But I think we're out of time. So to just have the very last question, which, how can we reduce stress in children? And we'll have to be fairly brief in that answer.
I love that question. I'm so concerned about our children and our young adults right now in terms of their mental health. And we, as caregivers, as teachers, as parents, need to realize that managing our own stress is incredibly important, not just for our own well-being, but for being the model, the co-regulator of the stress of our children. And so caregiver burnout and parental burnout during the pandemic was, incredibly hard, because it also, children are incredibly perceptive about stress. So I think shielding them from, of course, the news when they're young enough, it's just so toxic, and it gives them such a dark view of humanity. And shielding them as much as possible from social media, which has more negative than positive effects on our youth. It's also increasing their sense of isolation, loneliness, unworthiness, and really creating these times when you can be with a child with no screens and help them talk about their feelings and express their anxiety through play and through having them see that the world is, we know how to solve problems rather than presenting, we have a climate crisis that we don't know how to solve, and we can't burden them with those types of issues. It's too much for such young minds. And the truth is that we do have the tech, we are moving toward solving these problems. You wouldn't know it from the news, but the amount of good things that are happening, good actions every day from people, we need to tell our kids about those and seek those out. And I love something like Tank's Good News. It's like a social media Instagram that tells you about beautiful and happy things happening every day to real people. It always makes me smile and laugh.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the time where we've got to close, and what a great way, what a great set of insights you've given us, not only throughout this whole program, but also in this very last question. Was a great way to end. And so I just want to say, please join me in thank you to Alyssa, author of The Stress Prescription, 7 Days to More Joy and Ease. And
thank you so much.
Encourage everyone to pick up a copy of her book at a local bookstore or wherever you can. And if you want more background on how telomeres work and the many things besides stress we can do to help stabilize telomeres and to help us respond to stress, you can also look at the telomere effect. It was 5 years ago we co-published that, but the science really hasn't changed all that much, and we know we have to take care of them. So if you'd like to learn more about upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club events, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org/events. So I'm Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, and thank you for the time that you've spent with us. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for all that you do and for participating, and take care.